But first, we get into the case that, as of noon today, some different stage will be approached. Myron Farber, a reporter from the New York Times, as you heard Bob O'Brien talking about on his report, is facing jail at noon today unless the U.S. Supreme Court grants him some kind of a stay of sentence. Essentially, it's a crucial question, it's a very fundamental question here, the freedom of the press in conflict with the right of an individual to a fair trial. And I'm talking about the Dr. Yaskalovich trial. As we know, the press gets information in many cases by guaranteeing the people who give them the information confidentiality, guaranteeing that they will not reveal their sources. Now, if it becomes shown that an individual reporter does have to surrender certain information to the courts, that, without question, can affect the press's efforts to do a good job and essentially affects the press's freedom. We opened today's show with two people who have been jailed as a result of not turning over information, and one woman who has been threatened. Our guest today, a good friend of this program, Marie Torre. Welcome, Marie. It's good to have you with us. In 1959, she was in jail for 10 days. We'll find out the facts behind her story. Peter Bridge, who is a freelance journalist in New Jersey, spent 3 weeks in jail in 1972. And Marsha Kramer, investigative reporter for the New York Daily News, was convicted of contempt of court. Later in today's program, coming up in a few minutes, we'll have Warren Hoge from the New York Times, deputy metropolitan editor, talking about the Times' reaction to this. Attorney Roy Cohn will be speaking as to why he feels this information should be surrendered. And we also have a columnist for the New York Post, Diane Judge, with her opinions on it. But first, Marie, what happened in 1959? Tell us.
Okay, in
not
brief.
what it was like to be in jail for 10 days, but what got you there.
Okay, just briefly.
Yeah.
I wrote a column. I was at the New York Herald Tribune. I wrote a column about what was to be Judy Garland's first television special for CBS. I quoted a CBS executive who was very candid about how upset CBS was with her because she was not fulfilling her end of the bargain as far as they were concerned. I printed it before writing the column. I called Judy Garland's husband and manager, who was Sid Luft. He said there was nothing wrong. I quoted him as such. As a result of that column, Judy Garland filed a suit against CBS for $1,300,000. I was called in to give the name of the source because without the source's name, she could not pursue her case. A higher court ruled that while it would represent a curtailment of press freedom to force a reporter to talk, that the individual's right to fair trial was a more precious freedom. And therefore, the original decision held, which was either talk or go to jail. So I went to jail for 10 days.
And then what happened at the end of the 10 days?
At the end of the 10 days, there was an awful lot of public opinion that was on my side, fortunately, happily. I had been threatened with being sent back to jail. I could have been indefinitely. But because of public opinion being so strongly in my favor, Judy Garland's attorney called a news conference to say that he would not pursue the matter at that point, that when the case went to court, I could expect to be called. It wasn't until about 2 years later, or 3 years later, I think that CBS, which had since sued Judy Garland, CBS and Judy Garland canceled their suits against one another. And really for the first time that I was cleared of the threat of ever having to go to court and facing that issue again. Yes.
How far, Marie, were you prepared to go? 10 days in jail, it could be relaxing, it could have been also like a nightmare, but how far were you prepared to go to protect your rights and the press's rights?
While I was very determined, at the time I remember I said to my husband, listen now, when I step out, this was after 10 days when I was being released, I said, if you see anyone coming close to me with a paper in his hand, you know, with trying to get me back into court, I said, kick him, punch him, do anything. I want to get home to the kids.
Was it a dreadful experience, those 10 days? And how did you feel sitting? Did you feel like a political prisoner at all?
No, not political at all. I felt very strange because, hey, when you think about it, it's your own country sending you to jail, and you know that you're not a murderer, you're not a robber.
You know that you're right.
I thought I was right. I thought I was. And the one thing that really held me firm to this whole thing, Bill, is strange. My children were very young then, not 1 and not 2 years old. And this thought kept coming to me. What are they going to say when they get older? Mommy squealed. You know,
the jailbird. Mommy squealed. That's funny, Marie. Peter, essentially the same thing. Just tell us the circumstances that sent you to jail for about 3 weeks in '72.
Well, I was working as an investigative reporter for the New York News, which incidentally folded in the middle of all this. So by the time I went to jail...
As a result of this...
No. there were other forces at work in that. I didn't do it. And I wrote a story in which I quoted a housing authority commissioner as saying she had been offered a bribe for a specific purpose. There was a grand jury investigation going on at that time, and I was called before the grand jury and asked, hundreds of questions, very few of which had to do even with the story, but the court ruled that I was obliged to answer the questions. And also right in the middle of that, of course, the Brandsburg decision came down, in which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a reporter has no more immunity before a grand jury than the average citizen. Well, of course, you have sources and you have unpublished information to protect, and I did protect it, and so I refused to testify, and for my decision, I spent 20 days in jail.
During the 20 days you were in jail, what thoughts went through your mind about this question of the individual's right to a fair trial versus the freedom of the press, and which is a higher priority in our society?
But Bill, of course, in my case, there was no question of right to a fair trial versus right of a newsman. And I didn't really give it much thought while I was in jail. I've thought a great deal about it since then, and without boring you with a long dissertation, I'm getting a little bit frightened by the fact that whenever the First and the Sixth Amendments come in conflict, that strictly by virtue of the fact that judges rule the Sixth Amendment and operate that whole machinery, the Sixth Amendment always prevails. There have been decisions which say quite clearly, when these two amendments, these two articles of the Constitution come in conflict, the Sixth Amendment must prevail. And the First and the Sixth are both parts of the same Constitution. They're co-equal. One should not prevail over the other. Now, carrying that further logically, where do we go from there? I don't know.
Peter, why is it so crucial that an individual reporter have confidentiality, that there are shield laws, that he can operate as a reporter and not as any extension of the court system? Because
a newsman, a news person, certainly has no more rights under the First Amendment than anyone else, but the rights of Americans under the First Amendment are vast and meaningful. The newsman is different because he has the responsibility of executing those things which enforce those rights for everyone else. And therefore she is a special person, and therefore is obliged to protect sources who do not want to be identified for whatever their reasons. You don't get information without that kind of a promise. Even if you don't have to promise specifically every time, anyone who talks to you, who gives you information, has to feel confident that should the need arise, you will stand behind that principle.
Let me shift over to Marsha for a second. As an investigative reporter, what would happen to you if things changed, essentially, and you were dealing with people who knew that they couldn't expect total confidentiality from you?
I probably wouldn't be able to function as a reporter. I don't think that you can go to somebody and say, trust me, speak to me, tell me everything, if you can't say, well, I'll protect you from things. But I think that to talk about this issue in terms of being a reporter might be too parochial a view. I think that people have to realize that the First Amendment is their freedom of information, and a reporter is merely the conduit that provides that information to the public.
Point.
And so if you're saying, well, the reporter can't get sources, well, then we can't provide information to the public, and therefore they're the ones whose rights are abridged, not ours.
And just take a moment to tell us about your situation. You did not end up in jail, although you had a lot of conversations with a judge who almost sent you to jail.
Well, I was held in contempt but this was on our right to publish certain material regarding a murder trial that was going on in Brooklyn involving Sonny Carson, who was a well-known black community leader. The judge ordered us not to publish background information about the trial, and it was the decision of the editors at the Daily News that this was, an abridgment of our rights to publish. So I wrote a story saying the judge specifically ordered us not to say, and then I listed everything he said we weren't supposed to say. And I was held in contempt of court, but it was later overturned on a technicality because he hadn't held a hearing prior to the trial about this. So therefore, they could not, in the middle of the trial, say you can't print this information.
Okay, let's just take a break for a commercial. We'll get right back into this with Roy Cohn, Warren Hoge, and Diane Judge right after this break. Welcome back. We're talking about the Myron Farber case over in New Jersey. You're joined by three guests right now. Warren Hoge, who is Deputy Metropolitan Editor of the New York Times. A dream come true. Be a newscaster. Give us the latest on...
I have a bulletin.
Okay.
The Times just called.
Flash.
And said that, I'm not sure if it's the Supreme Court or a Supreme Court justice, but it has the same effect, has given Myron Farber now until midday Tuesday The deadline was 10 minutes from now. He now has, the stay is now extended. He stays out of jail. And
same questions are appropriate, though. Nothing changes
that's
in
right.
terms
Nothing,
of the...
substantially nothing has changed.
Right.
Yeah.
And they want what from him? All of his notes that he's been gathering from...
It's a very broad subpoena, yeah. That's one of our complaints about it, is that they want everything.
Okay. Roy Cohn is also with us. Certainly a well-known attorney, a man who, if you were in the same shoes as Jaskalovich's defense attorney, would you be doing the same thing, essentially?
Sure. I think you've got some basic issues. First of all, I think the Farber case is a very bad case to use as a precedent for freedom of the press, because I don't think most people realize what this case is about. This isn't a question of picking a newspaper man off the street and demanding he reveal his sources. The defense theory in the New Jersey case is that Farber himself was the instigator of the entire prosecution, that he secretly worked with the district attorney, with the medical examiner, and that he in himself was like a one-man grand jury who claims to have uncovered the case, furnished the testimony, set the stage for the trial. And an integral part of the defense case is that this was not just Farber, a newspaper man. This was Farber, an active antagonist of the defendant, who they have every right to have before the jury and bring out the facts before the jury of what his participation was. And I think to make this the historic next Zenger case or something on which we determine the rights of all newspapermen in the United States is rendering a disservice to some of the distinguished ladies and gentlemen here and to newspaper people all over the country.
Roy, you're off to a strong start, even though you're outnumbered 5-1. He's got his foot right in the door. Also with us is Diane Judge. Diane Judge is a columnist with the New York Post. Any reaction to what Roy just said there?
No, I kind of waver right in the middle. Half of what he says I think is absolutely right. This is the wrong case to bring it to the public's attention at the moment.
Dan, may I say something, too? There's never an ideal case. You know that.
Yeah.
When it comes to...
But I kind of agree that the New York Times really did start, but they have been acting more or less as prosecutor, and in addition to whatever the...
Are you doubting the intentions of the New York Times, then?
No, I just wonder legally how far whether or not it should have been turned over to the legal authorities in the state of New Jersey at the time sooner.
Well, they were turned over to legal authorities. Farber, in his discussions with Joe Woodcock, the prosecutor told him of statements and other materials that Woodcock didn't know about. And so Woodcock's investigators went back into the file, reopened it, and the indictments resulted.
But what is, let me shift back to Warren from the Times. What is Myron Farber saying, though, essentially, about these sources and about this material and about this specific question?
About, in a statement he made in court, Bill, I wish I had the exact language because the exact language mattered, but the burden of what he said was, there is nothing in my notes and documents that will prove the guilt or innocence of this man. This was an answer to the charge that Ray Brown, the attorney out there, when he alleged that there was, he called it a conspiracy, this thing that Roy is talking about.
Warren, let me ask you a question. Why wouldn't nobody said show it to the defense. The judges said, let me see it.
Sure.
And then I'll make a determination whether this bears upon the guilt or innocence of the defendant.
It's the same
so
thing.
If what you, why, no, it isn't the same thing.
Let me answer that. We think it is the same thing for this reason. You have, I mean, we think that traditionally the press in this country, and I think all of us will agree with this, it was meant to be independent from government. Okay, what is government? Government is 3 branches of government. Now, you may think of the judge as neutral. We don't. We think of the judge as part of the government.
Depends which
I mean,
judge.
The judiciary is a part of the government. So at that point, just to clarify, the judge out there has asked, as what he advanced as sort of a compromise, he said, give me the documents and I will decide whether the defense is right in its claim that this somehow will affect their defense. We didn't see that as any different, because when we give it to the judge, we're then giving it to, we become an arm of the government, is our argument against that action.
But Warren, the procedure in a courtroom generally is that these things are given to judges, even by prosecutors and all of that. A judge screens it. We call it 3500 material. It might bear on the defense and might prevent an injustice from occurring. A judge reads it in camera and strikes out certain portions and allows certain portions to go forward.
But once you do it with the news people, though, Roy, where do you stop? If you can let a judge see it, then maybe somebody else might say,
let me ask you all this question. Is there any doubt in anybody's mind that you're all legally wrong? In other words, does anyone here say that there is such a thing as a recognized legal privilege between a newspaperman and a source.
That's a trick question, though.
Why is that a trick question?
Because that's
There's
the
an
argument.
attorney-client.
You would have us decide that right here and now.
No, I'm suggesting...
I've decided it. Yes, we do.
Okay, I'm saying you don't.
The courts say the same thing as you, but I don't agree with you, and I don't agree with the courts.
You've just had a case of a priest here in New York who was ordered, I don't know what the facts in the thing were, I just read the headlines, Father Gigante or something. He was ordered by a divided court to reveal what he claimed was a part of a confession or something. The prosecution said baloney, that wasn't it at all, or something like that. But I said to you, as a matter of law, there's an attorney-client privilege, there's a doctor-patient privilege. There is not a newspaperman source privilege recognized by the law of this land.
But what about the state laws? There are 26 states that have shield laws.
And that New Jersey shield law is absolute in its granting of
No,
privilege.
it's not. It's not absolute. It's not even the shield law.
Well, somebody
it's a
take a moment and describe what a shield law is supposed to be.
Well, let Peter talk about it.
Go ahead.
Well, a shield law, a definition of a shield law is a statute which gives a privilege to a person, in this case a reporter, newsman, from revealing such things as sources, unpublished information, outtakes from film, and that sort of thing. The New Jersey Shield statute, while it sounds absolute, is exactly the opposite. Every time you include any other thing in that shield law, which was done last year, you actually increase the jeopardy because all of it is subject to Rule 37, which says if you reveal any part of the privileged material, you must reveal everything. And that's... I went to jail on that hook, and the expansion of the thing, it was demonstrated 1 week after the amendment was signed into law. The Bergen Record conducted an interview in a jail and was ordered to turn over the tapes and other material by virtue of publication. You see, they had revealed...
Under Rule 37, that was revealing part of the information?
No, Rule 37 is the exception to Rule 27, which is the shield law.
Yeah, but I mean, they ruled that by publishing the information, that was already...
That was
letting out some part of it over
that executed the exception. Which is to say,
I wanted to raise another question to the panel. There was a fellow named Senator Joe McCarthy a while back. He refused to reveal the identity of his confidential informants who gave him information about malfeasance, corruption, espionage, or whatever you will, in the government of the United States. I imagine papers represented by practically everybody, except Marsha, the Daily News was usually on his side, sitting here, demanded that McCarthy not protect these confidential informants. McCarthy said, I'm elected chairman of a congressional committee with a mandate, and I need this information to bring before the public the fact there are Alger Hisses and Harry Dexter Whites and so on and so forth. And he protected the identity, but the press went down on him like a ton of bricks. Richard Nixon, a couple of years ago, the same thing. The press says, who is the President of the United States to assert he has some kind of an executive privilege? A lot of nonsense. He has to come out with everything. But when the tables are turned and it comes back and it hits the New York Times or something like that, then we're all supposed to rally around the flag and say they're to be the Supreme Court and decide whether they should comply with the law like everybody else has to, or whether they're above the law.
Marsha wants to make a point.
I think your basic premise for attacking Myron Farber is wrong. I think that, you know, when you said, well, he thought he was the judge, the jury, the court, and everything else, might be wrong. I mean, what is the function of an investigative reporter if not to point out to the public things that may need looking into? I mean, you're saying there shouldn't be investigative reporters. I think that we have to defend Myron Farber's right to do what he did.
I think he went beyond. I say this case is a bad test case because most people think it just means, must a newspaper man reveal a source? I was just trying to point out that the Farber situation goes way beyond it. A defense in the case is that Farber was the motivating force, that he, in effect, tampered with witnesses, withheld evidence, got rid of one medical examiner, brought in another medical examiner from an outside state, and manipulated the case to fit in with the theory he had developed about it, and that Mr. Brown, the defense attorney, has the right to argue this to a jury.
And are you sure of those facts, though, Roy? How you not on speculation? Those are very strong
I'm
charges.
saying these are the allegations. Now, yesterday, the New York Times, a very good paper, printed a story which I thought very fairly summarized the facts, and if you read that story, you get just what I'm telling you. I'm not saying this all happened. I'm saying that this is the defense contention.
All right, Roy, we have to take a break for a commercial. We'll be right back, and we'll hear from Warren and some of the other reporters right after this. Some of the best parts of the show just went on during the commercial here, without question. Good discussion continuing on the Farber case in New Jersey. Diane Judge, you raised a good point.
I can't remember it.
It was about the
But you were
murderer
saying
going
that a
free.
murderer might go free
Yes,
because
I
of the...
said my general concern at the moment is that with all the hoo-ha over Farber of the Times, that an alleged murderer may go free, possibly hidden under a lot of the birdseed that's
Well, an
happening here.
alleged murderer is free. He's on trial.
Yes.
If he is acquitted or if the case is dismissed, then someone who was once suspected of murder may go free. We don't know if he's a murderer. We don't know that he is, and we don't know that he's not.
No,
It's
but that's
clouding
not what
the
Diane
issue,
is
though,
saying.
at the
Diane is
moment.
saying, suppose as a result of all this fuss, the case is dismissed, and if it had gone forward, he would have been convicted and
Exactly.
The prosecution
removed as a
has
menace to
completed its
society,
case.
a man who killed a number of people. And she said, is all this business about the New York Times lawyers thinking the First Amendment is being offended, is it really going to turn around and react against the public in that a man who might have been a vicious murderer is going to be walking the streets because Mr. Farber wants to go marching up and down to the Supreme
The
Court?
defense contends the opposite is going to happen. That's what the argument is about.
Yeah.
The defense is saying that we're debilitated because Farber won't give us what we want.
Yeah,
And
but
he's
that can be applauded
Wait a
too.
I don't know.
That's
Are
what
they
the
saying that they
defense is
cannot do
saying.
Ray
their
Brown's
job? that they-
standard operating technique in many trials that I have observed him on is always to subpoena reporters and try and get their records or notes. Most times he loses, but then he has appealable issues, so if his client is convicted, he can then say, we were hurt because this reporter didn't turn over this, didn't turn over that, and therefore we should have this conviction reversed. And you know yourself, Roy, that's a good tactic as a defense
Well, let me
attorney,
tell you
right?
something. It might be a good tactic, but the problem is sometimes it's true. Very briefly, and one of my have the advantage of having been everything in this game, including a defendant, successful, unfortunately, three times. Now, in two of my cases, Life magazine printed a really poisonous article about me, which got in front of the jury panel within a matter of days before my case did. Now, we subpoenaed the files of Life magazine, and as a result of that, we were able to uncover the fact that Life had written the articles in collaboration with the prosecutor who was trying the case against me. And it turned out to be a very, very important factor for us. Now, if we hadn't been able to do that, we would have been in rough shape. So there are, well, you're absolutely right, Marsha. Some lawyers, I don't think I've ever, except in that one instance, I don't think I've ever subpoenaed a reporter because I do think that the newspapers perform a very important informing function for the public of this country.
If you had
Roy,
your choice
go
between
ahead.
the Sixth and the First Amendment, which would you choose?
Probably Sixth.
Why?
You know,
Why the sixth? No, this is interesting. Why the sixth? I mean, they're both in the Constitution.
Okay, because I think...
Define each quickly
Okay, who
before
wants to
answering the
define
question.
the Sixth? Go ahead,
Well,
Peter.
the Sixth is the right to fair trial.
individual's right to
Right,
fair
an
trial.
individual's right to fair trial. The First Amendment is a right to freedom of press, right? And these
Press,
ladies
religion.
and gentlemen would say the right of the public to have a free press, which can act as a watchdog, a non-political watchdog, looking out for the interests of the public, uncovering corruption, going up and down the country, and keeping politicians and others and prosecutors.
Wedding and birth notices,
I
too,
think,
don't
I
forget.
think
Well,
it's
absolutely
easily
an
described as
advertising
freedom of
show.
information.
Okay, freedom of information. All right, those are the two conflicting things.
Aren't more people affected by the First Amendment, actually?
I don't know. I think this. I think a person's liberty in an individual case is more important because I don't think that newspaper people, no matter what we're saying on this program today, are going to be out of business if there's a danger they might have to reveal the source. They have an alternative. Their alternative is be brave like Marie and go to jail for 10 days. But there is no pattern where newspaper men have or are going away for 5 years or 2 years or 1 year. I'd rather have a newspaper man
Not
have a
yet.
few uncomfortable moments
That's not the
than
point,
have an
Roy.
innocent man
That's
go
not
to
the
jail.
Let me shift over to Warren for a second. Go ahead.
I want to answer the interesting question that Diane raised at the very beginning of this particular segment. I mean, assuming, and this is only an assumption, that this man is a vicious murderer, okay, and he were to go free, okay, it would be our contention that it's not the fault of the New York Times, it's the fault of the prosecution in that county or the judge or somebody else. But secondly, this trial would probably have never happened had it not been for the New York Times.
That's the irony
In other
of the
words,
situation,
if your concern
Yes,
is,
I know that.
if we assume this man is a killer and he will go free, you can be guaranteed that he would have remained free.
I remember
had it not
all
been.
those
And that is the
wonderful-
other side, and that really is what the argument's about. I mean, you sacrifice something enormous over here for being totally secure in that concern you had over here.
I wonder, it's an interesting point. Why was Mr. Farber on the case right from the beginning? Was it his baby right from the beginning?
Yeah, it was again, as things often happen, it was a letter to the New York Times. I think it was an anonymous letter. before I worked there. It was 3 or 4 years ago. And as we often do as editors, we have investigative reporters like Marsha here, and we give them a note and say, pursue it, and most of them, you know, come up dry, right? This particular one, there seemed to be something there, and Myron got very involved. It was an investigation of months and months.
And then how was it very clever? It was almost like a very calculated drama opening up as we read all these little items, almost like a gossip column, where you would read an item where Dr. X, I mean, there was all this mystery about, I mean, the whole thing was almost set up to become exactly what it is today,
You know, Diane,
which is very interesting. I mean, I'm not knocking
Are you
the Times.
suspicious of the story?
No. No. It's just
Peter, are you
interesting.
suspicious of
That
the
it
story?
continues to be a close
Yes,
celeb,
and it's interesting that the New York Times, of all papers, would have behaved this way because they're supposedly
well, they're unpredictable.
yes, conservative and, you know, this is not their usual style.
You know, one of the issues that's being avoided, you mentioned it before, Warren, and that is the fact of the subpoena. The subpoena is one of those classic fishnet subpoenas. Give me everything you've got. When they claim to know something of what Warren Farber has, but they don't care. Give me everything, your wife, your children, your home, your furniture.
I want to suggest one thing. Isn't there an easy solution, an obvious solution to this whole thing, which answers everyone's objection? The thing we're overlooking, which was raised before, Farber has not been required to turn this over to the defense. All he's been asked to do is what a prosecutor in any case has to do, is submit it to the judge. Now, we have to assume the judge is an honest person.
Yeah, we come back to the same point, though.
Why?
Well, what was again, it's the same rebuttal of that. It's tantamount to the same thing, turning it over to the judge.
Because when you turn it over to the judge, you're thereby giving the judge discretion, if he wishes to turn it over to the defense. But I'm saying, if what the Times says is so, and I'm sure that they say it in complete good faith, when the judge reads this, he's going to look it over, close the folder, and say, I am not going to require it be turned over because it has no relevancy or materiality to the case on trial. And I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, I've read it, I've looked at it, and go on and call your next witness. And a phony issue is eliminated, and they go ahead and they convict the murderer if he be murdered.
All right, let's hear Warren Hoge from the New York Times. Go ahead,
Suppose this is the Roy Cohn case, not the Dr. X case in New Jersey. And I've been taking notes. And I've written on my notes at one point, someone came to me and said, you know, Roy Cohn's really a thief. I wrote that down. Then I later learned from 4 other sources that information was wrong. But I'm not going to go back and erase that thing. Okay, those documents go to a judge. He sees Roy Cohn as a thief. Those are raw notes. I mean, the editing process hasn't happened. You don't want him to see that as the defendant or the prosecutor.
He wouldn't turn it over based upon that.
But he might think that was a very important piece of information.
I don't think he would. I think any judge with any sense, he would have a he'd have an in-camera hearing. He would only turn over information which is, in his opinion, passes the test of reliability, materiality to the case on trial, would take care of Peter's argument about the broadness of the subpoena and everything else. I just think that in not even letting a judge deal with this, we're condemning a whole system of the judiciary, and we have a right to look to them. And if we look to them in a case like this, we avoid all problems. We avoid Mr. Farber's problem, and we avoid the problem of a possible murderer going free.
Roy, excuse me a second. We have to take a break. We'll continue for one more segment. Roy, what would happen to you if you had to reveal your sources?
As a lawyer?
Yeah.
I don't.
But if you had to.
An attorney-client privilege persists. You mean if someone told me to violate the attorney-client privilege?
Yeah.
I do just what Mr. Farber's doing.
It's
Okay.
not your privilege
Interesting
anyway,
answer.
the client's.
If I had a legal privilege, now my privilege is limited. It's to a confidential communication. Everything you tell a lawyer is not privilege. It must be a confidential communication. If it is in furtherance of a commission of a crime, it is not privilege. If a third person is present, it is not privileged. It must be intended as a confidential communication. But if I were ordered by some prosecutor, which is very possible, to reveal it, I would do exactly what Warren's doing and his paper's doing and what Mr. Farber's doing.
Okay, good. We'll be back to continue for a couple more minutes right after this. And don't forget, we'll also get into the test tube babies as well. Okay, let me shift over to Peter Bridge, who was a freelance journalist in 1972, spent 3 weeks in jail. Peter, you have an interesting point here about how this could be handled, I think.
It's a point, and it doesn't come from my own conclusion. It's really a question of Roy. Roy, rather than go in camera and review all of this mass of what Farber may or may not have, what it would be the objection, at least in terms of Sixth and First Amendment points, in saying the judge saying to the reporter, and I would prefer anything said to a reporter and any answer given be in public, Myron Farber, do you have this? Do your notes say that? Rather than throw out this fishnet and bring everything back in, what do you want?
I agree with you. I think it should be done. I think that probably is one of the solutions. That would eliminate the point Marsha raised that, well, this is Ray Brown's usual trick, you know, call a newspaper man and then get a mistrial declared because you know he's not going to answer or something like that.
Ray Brown did this to me once, too, you know.
Grounds for an appeal later on.
Sure. I think it'd be a completely sensible thing for a
I'm
judge to say,
curious.
what are we talking about? Let's find out if there's anything there before we go and make a big
A
fuss out
reporter
of it.
might still refuse to answer the question, but at least the world would know
Well, we
why
have to
he's
ask
Well, no,
Warren.
it wouldn't be done under a subpoena, and if there's no subpoena situation, I think maybe reporters might tend...
Well, let's
you know,
ask Warren, and I don't know, it's probably too tough a question to ask him. He'd have to consider it. But suppose it were done the way Peter suggested. What would have been the Times policy, or what would have been Farber's response if the judge...
Yeah, I mean, first of all, obviously that would be a lawyer's decision, so I'm kind of guessing what it would be. But that sounds much more palatable. We have had situations where reporters have testified. Myron himself has testified. He took his privilege a couple of times, and I wasn't there, so I'm not quite sure what question it was triggered. But that sounds better. I was going to raise something else just for a moment. Do any of you in this panel take notes that are legible enough for a judge to read?
That's true, but there was one other point. Whenever we talk about laws protecting news sources and the exceptions, you often hear in national interest and life and death matter. Now, you do have a life and death matter here.
You have a life and death matter. If a subpoena were drawn in such a way that, I mean, the only theories we have about sort of conspiracy and cooperation between Mr. Farber and prosecution are things that the defense attorney has said in court. They've been denied by all the witnesses who would be involved under oath. So, I mean, if a subpoena were drawn very close, and you really had a life and death situation, I think you would have a very different legal situation.
What do you mean really have a life and death situation?
I'm
Don't
not
you
good
think
at
that...
those sort of legal, you know,
No, but I mean, don't you think that this could happen? I mean, that
No, I think, because I believe Myron Farber, who said under oath that there was nothing in his notes that would affect the guilt or innocence of this man, that was not available.
But now isn't he setting
to the
himself
court.
up as the judge when he says this?
No, no, he's
Judge
saying,
and the
he's
jury.
saying you know everything that I know. You know, it was published in the New York Times.
He didn't say that, though.
I have nothing. Well, that's the burden of him saying, I have nothing that you need, that, you know.
Yeah, but Warren, you're narrowing your position. Even if he had something someone needed, you'd still stand by his privilege and say, even if that's not the issue, you're retreating from it. You're really saying, the Times is saying, the First Amendment must come first, ahead of the Sixth and everything else. And even if those notes are going to have a dramatic effect one way or the other on guilt or innocence, the right of the public to know and the right of our reporters and every newspaper in America's reporters to say to a source, tell me who's a crook, tell me who killed somebody, and I will always protect what you told me, that is an overriding consideration.
But Roy, the practicality of the matter is that if I was out covering a story and I had somebody give me some information which was really good, do you think I was going to sit on it? I'm going to print it in the Daily News. I'm not going to sit on it and hold it as some big secret thing. I mean, you know, you want to print that stuff, and I think that with Myron Farber, he's printed all the stuff he's had.
And also, you're going to print it only when you know it's right and true.
Absolutely.
If you have to give it to a judge when it's unproven allegations, that doesn't advance the process at all.
Well, I'm still saying that it can be a situation where a jury could be impressed by the fact that a newspaper man engineered a whole case, brought in an out-of-state examiner instead of the local, you know.
That's been denied, by the way, you know, by Dr. Bod
I don't
himself,
know.
just as to establish that.
All right, you know, we only have a minute here, and I think essentially what we'll probably do is, since Myron Farber's decision comes up on Tuesday at noon, we probably will continue this at some point next week. And I want to thank everybody for being here. It's kind of obvious why Roy Cohn has done so well in the courts over the years. 5 against 1, and I think he's done a pretty good job today. But I also think we've raised...
five have done a pretty good job today.
Equally well, and I also feel we've raised some of the crucial questions that make this one of the major news stories of the week.
When do you file your amicus brief with us? Do we take it back to the office?
I want to think about that overnight.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Warren, if you had to project a little bit into the future, what do you think might happen in this case?
Oh, gee,
I'll project.
Let Roy project. I'm afraid to, because it really is a matter for
I think Farber's going to lose.
Farber will lose, you
On the simple point, there is no legally recognized newspaper man's privilege.
You may not have a trial after next week. The judge has already commented in court that no murder has been proved. If he dismisses the case Monday and Farber's in the Supreme Court...
then, as a reporter, what does Farber do when he feels he's got a case for murder?
Well,
but it's not his responsibility to have a case for murder.
He started the whole thing.
That's my point.
I know it is. Yeah, but I mean, we're not the prosecution.
That's how I
Myron Farber did
hope.
nothing after that. I mean, unless he could prove some great court error of perjury or something.
We have to stop here. I have a woman waiting in the wings who
The big
wants
answer
to have
to
the
that
same
last-
procedure done to her as they did in London.
The
Go ahead,
answer
Roy.
is that if this fellow goes free, if this fellow goes free, we take him over to the electric chair they keep behind Abe Rosenthal's desk in the New York Times.
We'll be back right after this to get into test tube, baby. Stay with us.